With me today, my name is Tim Aron. I'm a barrister at Minerva Chambers. Philipp Pieper from Swan Markets and Andrew Horbury from Net Zero Capital. The plan we had before this technical difficulty was to kick off with Andrew, giving a bit of an overview of the current regulatory framework for decentralized platforms, and then we were going to widen it out into a wider discussion. So, Andrew, would you mind sort of kicking it off and sort of setting the sort of legal and regulatory framework as you see it?
Yeah, absolutely. I think on that, the first thing to highlight with this is how cyclical regulation, as many other things are, the cyclical nature of regulation. I mean, look, crypto likes to move fast and break things. It's part of the reason the space moves so fast. It's part of the reason we have so much innovation in such a short period of time. We have so many amazing, wonderful things and groundbreaking things going on. Now, you take regulation, and in many ways, regulation is the antithesis of all of those things, of what crypto is. It's regulation's slow, it's steady, it's stabilizing, and all of that is for good reason, right? Regulation has to have those features because regulation and regulators have to meet their objectives, the protection of consumers, market stability, market integrity, the protection of a financial system against financial crime and criminal money and terrorist financiers. Now, because we have this dynamic of the tech moving fast, we then have the dynamic of regulation and regulators having to catch up. And in that gap between those two things of the tech and the innovation happening and then regulation, catching up, generally what happens is we find projects they sit outside of the scope of that regulation, or regulation doesn't exist, or it's interpreted that regulation doesn't exist to cover that particular area. And that's exactly what we had back in 2014 through to 2017, 2018, when I was first moving into the crypto space. Crypto exchanges were not subject to regulation. Even at the most basic end of that, which is AML, CFT supervision from anti-money laundering, countering the financing of terrorism perspective, they weren't in scope. But yet myself, as a compliance consultant, and many other lawyers, regulatory experts would say, well, hang on a minute, all of that stuff should be sitting inside of the existing anti-money laundering regulation that exists around the world. But nevertheless, it didn't. And it took, the likes of the Financial Action Task Force, FATF, to publish additional guidance to state, wait, no, hang on, all of that sort of activity does need to sit within the realms of regulation. It poses a risk from a money laundering, terrorist financing perspective. It needs to sit in scope. It needs to be brought in scope of everything. And when FATF does something like that, they effectively affirm that gap where everything sat outside regulation was indeed correct, because they've now had to actually bring something into force to cover that area. And that's what happened. 2018 guidance, update to the recommendations from FATF, then saw the introduction of further regulation in the EU and the UK. We had the 4th and 5th anti-money laundering directives, which brought crypto to crypto trading and then crypto to fiat trading in scope, and required those providers to apply anti-money laundering and countering the financing of terrorism controls like a traditional financial services organization would do. And the reason I'm drawing the comparison here is because this is exactly what we now have had with the rise of DeFi, with the rise of DEXs. We've had this period whereby the technology has moved on at a rapid pace and regulation has lagged behind. And in that gap, decentralized exchanges, DeFi protocols, DeFi arrangements have said, well, actually, what we're doing isn't covered within that regulation, within those regulatory regimes that you brought everything else in scope of. This is different. We are distinguishing it. And, what are the grounds that a lot of DeFi stuff is being distinguished on? Primarily, my interpretation is it's on a peer-to-peer basis. We're saying, well, actually, there is no centralized party doing that. It's operating on a peer-to-peer basis. We've just got smart contracts intermediating this. But for all other intents and purposes, people are peer-to-peer. And then once again, we have FATF in its sort of supranational position stating, well, actually, no, we see that DeFi arrangements, DeFi protocols, decentralized exchanges as part of that do pose a risk. There is a risk here that money launderers terrorist financiers may wish to use those protocols, those platforms, in order to meet their goals and their objectives. So we've now had a further FATF guidance and the update to the recommendations that come part and parcel with that, which is now saying, well, look, DeFi in many cases is going to sit in scope, or perhaps, a better way to phrase it, double back on that, is there are instances where a DeFi arrangement may be required to sit in scope. And a lot of the focus now around this is on whether there is a real world, a centralized party behind that. They focus on the concepts now of control, or the ability to exert significant influence over that arrangement. More simply, we're saying who's responsible, or under what circumstances do the parties behind it actually become responsible. And when I say responsible, I mean for AML CFT compliance. Who's going to do KYC? Who's going to conduct CDD? And in my opinion, the most of the platforms for DeFi arrangements we see today are going to be caught in scope of that. Very few will be sufficiently decentralized enough to be, so far separated from any legal or natural person's influence or control to say that they completely fall outside of the scope of this. So, the FATF wording, I think, is creators, owners, operators, or other persons with control or influence. And that's really, I guess, the key thing that people are discussing at the moment. A lot of the conversations I'm involved in is, do we fall within that? Or actually, is our protocol, or is our platform sufficiently decentralized that it couldn't be considered that we are a virtual asset service provider and therefore responsible for all its compliance? But in my opinion, there's very few that will fall into that category. I guess the other thing that a lot of people are talking about at the moment, a lot of the conversations I'm involved in, is, look, FATF guidance has come through. It's now up to the various jurisdictions to legislate in accordance with what the FATF guidance and recommendations say. That's going to take time. There's then going to be likely transition periods once that regulation comes into force. But of course, it is eventually going to happen. I guess the key takeaway from that and the current standpoint is decentralized finance does pose a risk from a money laundering or terrorist finance perspective. Therefore, it needs to be subject to some form of regulation to mitigate the risk that poses to the global financial system. And you've already got an instance where it's hard to find good regulatory and compliance staff in traditional finance. Now try and couple that with a significant number of DeFi protocols and platforms who are going to need money laundering reporting officers, compliance teams who are not only good and strong on a compliance or regulatory standpoint, but also need to understand what we mean when we're talking about liquidity pools or smart contracts or all the various things we have kicking around in crypto and in DeFi specifically. So I think I'll hand it over there, but based on the time we've got. But that's where we're currently standing. I think a lot of the focus is around the FATF guidance, whether DeFi platforms, DeFi arrangements, as FATF call them, should be in scope, under what circumstances they will be in scope. And if we are in scope, speak candidly, what the hell are we going to do about it? It is kind of a perspective of a lot of platform operators who haven't proactively gone and embraced regulation voluntary when it's not yet been an express requirement of them.
Thanks, Andrew. Ian, I stepped into your shoes, but I'll hand back to you. You were the planned moderator, so I'll relax now.
Thank you, everyone. Firstly, my sincere apologies for joining the panel late, and thank you for stepping in the interim as a top substitution. Appreciated, and thank you, Andrew, for setting the scene there on regulation. And I know we only have 15 minutes or so left, so I'll dive straight into the next question, if I may. For Philipp to discuss how DEXs can, for example, protect against illicit finance. I know Andrew touched on that, but just to dive a little deeper, as co-founder of Swarm Markets, a DEX, a decentralized exchange that is the world's first licensed DeFi protocol through the German regulator BaFin. Perhaps, Philipp, you can discuss the thinking at Swarm behind the strategy of taking this regulatory approach, and perhaps discuss your journey to getting through the licensing application. And do you see this perhaps as a unique selling point for your protocol?
So all that in 5 minutes. We'll start at least. I think thanks Andrew for setting the scene, because I think there's some important points that actually sort of are coming to effect here. So I think it was around about 2 years ago when we actually sort of saw in the industry that it was becoming evident that regulation would be coming more into effect. Even centralized exchanges, but as well as decentralized mechanisms would be sort of taken a view on by the regulators, and to us that meant actually an opportunity rather than a threat. So historically speaking, we as Swarm, as a project, starting in 2017, we've always been around enabling technology to actually enable compliance regulation, compliance necessities. And this had the term of security tokens back then. So it was always about like building that bridge to something that was footed in the real world, in a real world asset setup, and then managing both from a documentation, from an enforcement, from an onboarding perspective, managing how can that actually sort of replicate itself onto a blockchain-based use case. Now, a lot of that tokenization vision was about benefits of tokenization resulting from liquidity. But as we all know, liquidity was really, really hard to do, and there was hardly any kind of regulatory environment to find globally where actually sort of liquidity on these kind of assets was something that was feasible, or was actually something that was really exploiting and replicating the benefits and the leverages that the blockchain presents. So when Germany then came along with the amendment of the Banking Act, end of 2019, of taking effect early 2020, for us that meant a hefty road to get to that licensed situation. But it also meant that if we succeeded in actually becoming a trusted counterparty for the regulator, and therefore a trusted counterparty to all sorts of other institutions, we could actually make it possible that we at least would become sort of an intermediary in terms of technology that other institutions and players could then transact with. And two benefits that we are striving to actually bring to the market on this. Number one, there's a bunch of people that are sitting on the sidelines that are just in awe of what DeFi and the opportunities of DeFi present, but they can't engage because they don't know what it means for their business from a compliance, as well as from an engagement perspective, as well as from a counterparty perspective, right? So to be an enabling facilitator for those audiences. Number two, there's actually a huge amount of innovation that Andrew was referring to that DeFi presents, and we can go into different use cases, but there's some very groundbreaking new concepts in terms of network liquidity, the peer-to-peer aspect, who can participate in certain models, the composability of technology at that point in time, that actually at this point in time, it's become evident to the broader financial ecosystem that these methods can become a way of institutions to communicate amongst each other, to actually build hybrid products amongst institutions, to build derivative products in a much more transparent and enforceable way. And so with that, we actually hope to add new Lego pieces to the DeFi stack that so far couldn't be part of this ecosystem, and therefore obviously can represent a much different and probably even larger magnitudes, larger value than what the blockchain and the blockchain crypto assets specifically mean today. So it took some time to get to where we are, but and there's still some heavy lifting to be done actually to create further elements of that trust stack that I was just describing. But what we did and try to make sure along the way is that that we preserve the core benefits of what DeFi actually still represents, meaning we are absolutely subscribing to self-custody. We subscribe to the transparency of the contracts. We subscribe to these concepts of networked and peer-to-peer liquidity and other mechanisms, and still being able to convey that to the regulator and be able to gain a trusted situation with the regulator. So it's not enough for existing projects in DeFi to just put KYC in front of their offering, because that doesn't actually get them into that trusted realm with the regulatory bodies, which is a much longer path. And it has a lot to do not just with KYC and CDD, but it also has to do with just knowing what the organization is that you represent and actually sort of doing everything you have to do to be compliant with their expectations. So we hope that this will be a contribution that will actually generate a lot of added elements to the ecosystem, and alongside with what the requirements are to others, it may actually present a way for a feasible future-proof trading as we've started to learn and love it in DeFi going forward.
Thank you for that answer, Philipp. And I'm sure there's a number of folks in the community that have a completely opposite view, focus on a philosophy of code is law. However, we've seen enforcement action in the US against a number of DEXs. So this is quite progressive strategy by Swarm. So congratulations on getting through that. All right, let's move on. Let's move on the questions now to Tim. Broaden out the discussion around regulation and new business models and the growth of the infrastructure here. So in the wide-ranging work you're doing, Tim, with a number of DeFi protocols, let's move the discussion on to the arena in terms of additional regulatory clarity, whether that's on disclosures of risks, code audits, risk management, market integrity, for example. Perhaps can you discuss how you see new business models and the market infrastructure changing in the next few years?
Sure. I think there are a number of developing approaches to this, and just picking up on some of the ideas that Andrew is putting out. I think what you're seeing is that a lot of projects are at the moment forum shopping, and obviously you've got the likes of Swarm who've chosen a jurisdiction and focused on it, and they see the advantages. And a number of projects, as you alluded to, Ian, are very much of the kind of mentality that they just don't want to opt in, and they want to stay outside of that regulatory perimeter so long as they possibly can. And I think what you're getting from the regulators, you see it certainly in the EU with the legislation that's coming through at the EU level, but also from some of the smaller jurisdictions which are developing fairly sophisticated, fairly developed crypto regimes, various different approaches. So you've got some fairly developed ones, say in the EU. You've got some sort of middle level ones, perhaps in places like Astana, maybe Abu Dhabi as well. And then you've got some jurisdictions which are more sort of on the periphery. And then you've got some which are even more on the periphery. And you can get a license there and you can do anything in those jurisdictions, provided you're not doing things selling to persons in those jurisdictions. So I think what you're going to see is projects, in a sense, choosing between those four options. And in many ways, I imagine the trend will be that those who see that they can exist and they can service their clients with the least regulatory input and with the least tax exposures that come with that, they will choose to stay outside. And those are the very pure projects in that sense. But I think there'll be a point at which, and I think maybe Swarmer saw this coming, that jurisdictions will attract some of those more peripheral players in, because they'll need somehow to link into the wider financial services sector. So they'll need, for example, to be able to link up with service providers that are caught within the jurisdiction. And I think that would be the pattern. But I think what you'll see for the next few years is a real resistance to this. And the interesting thing that comes out of it is that the longer these entities can stay out, these projects can stay out of regulation, I think the more innovation you'll see, and the more you'll see in the way that various projects find solutions that are pure crypto solutions rather than needing to opt into the license regime. And you can see that with some of the I was going to say deposit takers, but the likes, sort of banking solutions, insurance solutions, and the like that are coming through. And those have developed just because I think the established financial sectors and the established financial players haven't necessarily opened their doors to crypto. So I think that the longer these entities can stay outside of regulation, in a sense, the better it is for the development. But gradually there'll be a move in, because there'll be a need to find this form of integration. And I think what the challenge for the regulators is that they only have, in a sense, a couple of tools in their toolkit. They either catch you because you're established in their jurisdiction, or they catch you because you're marketing into their jurisdiction. One of those two broad ways. And somehow or another, the regulators need to find a way to encourage projects in, and to allow them to be innovative, and to allow them to remain sort of loyal to their kind of core crypto philosophy, but at the same time not totally stifle them. And I think the difficulty of regulators is the moment they start bringing these technologies in and giving them the licenses which the legacy actors have, the technology will overtake and surpass and better the technology available to the existing actors, and then suddenly they'll find that their financial sectors as they currently exist cease to actually remain competitive, and they've got to somehow maintain those financial that existing financial sector and the tax revenues that come with it. And they've got to find that balance between the two. And I think that's going to be a really tricky game. And it may well be the likes of the UK who've probably messed up opportunities to develop crypto in the last 3 or 4 years, when they could have certainly, taken advantage of Brexit and taken advantage of the existence of the city and all of the established actors they've got there who are very keen to move into this area. They don't necessarily grasp the nettle and develop these areas, but some of these new financial sectors, Singapore, etc., actually really find a way to find that balance. So I think that's going to be the interesting area to watch.
If it's okay, I want to comment with one thing, and it's great that you mentioned sort of the regulatory positions in this. I personally don't think that regulation is a self-purpose. Like, regulation is something that is required by larger groups that actually are established players that actually have built their businesses based on the neutrality that the market is ensured by regulation. So if we're now in this phase of a market where the early adoption is now sort of crossing the chasm into the traditional financial markets, and traditional financial market players are needing to find that kind of solidity to then actually be able to play with that, you're right, it may actually not have the bleeding edge of creativity, one goes right, one goes wrong, but that's also not for them. Giving them the basis in order that they can engage, and therefore, adding new volume, new players to the market that previously had a hard time really engaging. So regulators are not they're not having their own agenda in this. They're just basically trying to make sure for the established players that are abiding by those kind of regulatory rules that they have a basis to be able to engage.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Philipp, and thank you, Tim, for your answer. I notice we're getting close to the end of our session. Apologies if there are any questions that are missed. I just picked one up here from somebody in the audience just for the last 30 seconds. We are seeing the UK pretty slow. Why do you think this is? And do you think we will see a race to speed things up? Assume that's around regulation and not around people building and developing, because there's a number of projects that we know based in the UK, whether fully decentralized or not. But Crypto UK, that's our aim. Our aim is to help educate, especially around DeFi, specifically at the government level, policymakers, senior politicians, and also the regulators. Very important that we help those folks understand exactly what the societal benefits are of some of the new and exciting dApps available to the community. So I think we've hit our time. Again, sincere apologies for being late to the panel, but thank you very much, Tim, for stepping in. And it's a pleasure speaking with you today, Philipp and Andrew. We wish you a good conference, those that are attending in person tomorrow. Back to our organisers. Thank you very much.
Thanks, guys. Cheers, everyone.
Thank you.